Greetings. This lecture is on employee safety and health. It's a few slides long, so it shouldn't take us too long to get through the material. The first slide addresses the different components that are a part of risk management. And as you can see, risk management or safety isn't just about I tripped and I fell and I broke my arm at the job, or I was involved in an industrial accident. Workplace safety expands much more beyond that to not only accidents that can occur in the workplace, but exposure to chemicals that may compromise my health. It could be I'm overweight, or I'm sitting at my desk too often and too long. I'm having my eyes are strained because I'm looking at a computer screen. I have repetitive motion injuries. I could be at risk because somebody may come into my workplace and affect my coworkers, or bring a gun to the workplace, or someone who's too stressed can't deal with it. So there's a whole lot of different aspects that may affect me specifically, and then there's things that we really can't control. Through any kind of protocols, through, for example, floods or fires or earthquakes or things like that. And the company needs to be prepared to deal with those things that they have no control over. So we have 4 basic areas of safety, and companies need to develop a plan that's pretty comprehensive that addresses all those issues. And HR plays a really important role in this, but there are other aspects that managers also play a significantly important role. So let's go to the next slide where it says who handles these responsibilities, and this gets you a really good sense of what balance of things is managed by HR versus other departments. Workers' comp stuff for the most part is managed by HR. There are occasions when another department might be involved, or it might be outsourced, but for the most part, majority of the times, workers' comp is handled by the organization itself. And the same thing largely with health and wellness plans, where they have smoking cessation or weight loss cessation or things like that. Drug testing, not all companies do drug testing, but those that do, about 1/3 of them manage the stuff in-house. The rest of it is, contracted out to somebody else to do for the most part. Safety, inspections, and OSHA compliance is not always handled in HR, and in fact, many times is handled by a safety department or a medical department, for the company. The larger the company, the more likely they are to have a dedicated safety management department headed by a safety specialist. But in smaller organizations, a lot of OSHA compliance issues are managed by the HR department, particularly where OSHA issues are minimal. There's not really a workplace where OSHA doesn't matter. OSHA matters in every company, but there are some industries and some companies where it plays a larger part of the role in managing people, and in those situations, OSHA is typically handled under a safety management group. Companies like, for example, a large manufacturing environment like a U.S. Steel or Monsanto, where the exposure to chemicals and things like that might be fairly high, and so they will have their own safety department that manages that. And then lastly, safety training. To some extent it's managed by the HR department, but largely it's done in conjunction with the managers in the different departments, because they know the safety protocols for how to best handle being safe on equipment or in processes and things like that. And also there may be a safety management department in some larger corporations, very similar to the OSHA compliance issues, where they're involved in the supervision of safety training and things like that. So where does management largely play a role? Mostly managers play a role in safety inspections and safety training. To some extent, they're involved in supporting health and wellness programs rather, helping people to get off of drugs or helping them to lose weight and sort of supporting their employees to do that. Managers may be involved in giving feedback or testimony on workers' comp situations, but for the most part, your role as managers is going to be making sure your workplace is safe, you're complying with OSHA rules, and then you're ensuring that you're training your workers how to be as safe as possible because of liability issues. OSHA itself, as we talked about OSHA already, is the Occupational Safety and Health Act, passed in 1970. And the goal here was to make sure that our workers could be as safe as possible. Um, OSHA has a lot of standards that it sets for companies to follow in terms of certain procedures, known policies, known practices, known equipment. But regardless of what you may know or not know about safety, even if there isn't a known protocol or a known standard of safety that an organization holds, a company is still liable. They have a general duty, as it says there, to provide safe and healthy working conditions for their employees. So in a situation where there may not be a standard to fall back on that OSHA has written, you still are obligated to find the safest way for your employees to be able to do something in order to protect them. And you'll see posters all over the place in companies talking about, stress or repetitive motion injuries or, things like sexual harassment, which are considered, a stress-inducing factor that might be covered under OSHA. And you'll see these posters all over the place. And I bet you could find some here on campus talking about, workplace violence and things like that. Our next slide. So what areas does OSHA manage and what kind of standards do they set? The first thing that they manage is hazard communication and teaching people to understand where there is a hazard that could lead to an accident and to ensure people are talking about those hazards and fixing those hazards. And they work as a really good resource to help companies identify hazard areas so that they can avoid accidents in the future. OSHA also covers things like bloodborne pathogens. So if someone is bleeding in front of you, they have a procedure for how you're supposed to handle that so that you don't pass on things like hepatitis or HIV through bloodborne pathogens, through bloodborne liquid. Sorry. Other things that it covers: personal protective equipment, things like safety shoes and safety goggles and equipment and clothing to cover your skin so that it protects you from the workplace. So there's all sorts of rules on that. Now, if you choose not to wear those safety shoes, are you liable? No, you still are responsible for, the company is still responsible for that injury, although the point of not wearing the protective equipment, that you may get penalized for that in your company, but you'll still be covered under workers' comp. Cumulative stress disorders, when people are working too much overtime or they're working a job where they're repetitively using the same muscle groups or the same movements, you create cumulative stress on the bones, on the muscles, on the tendons. You get more likely to have tendinitis and carpal tunnel syndrome and things like that. And OSHA also oversees work assignments, how work is assigned, in what manner is it given to people, what's the process that people have to do in order to do their work so that it helps them to manage their environments better. All right, so the next slide is the guide to recording cases under occupational safety and health. We are responsible in organizations to record any potential accidents or deaths or things along that nature. So you've got some decision rules. If you have something that happened that in a workplace where someone has a broken bone or a broken arm and it didn't result from a workplace accident or any kind of exposure in the workplace, we don't have to report accidents that happened in your own home to OSHA. It's not our business. Whatever happened in your house is your business. If something happened in the workplace or when you're on work time, an accident and exposure, things like that, there's different levels of reporting depending on what occurred. If there's a death or an illness, absolutely it has to be recorded immediately and goes directly to OSHA to let them know that we have had a death in the workplace, directly related to workplace issues, or there was a specific illness that was absolutely directly related to workplace issues. Injuries depends on the kind of injury we have. If you have an injury that is a loss of consciousness, it requires medical treatment beyond, a simple Band-Aid or a simple burn, simple first aid issues. If you have restrictions now on the kind of work that people can do, or if people are had to be transferred to another job because they're incapable of doing that job, these sorts of things need to be recorded. Because obviously they're serious enough that OSHA needs to look at them and say, well, why did this injury occur where the person can no longer do this job? So what's the problem behind that? If it doesn't meet that standard, if it's something that's just a basic first aid, and or I scratched myself, these sorts of things don't need to be reported to OSHA because they just don't care about those things. Those are, one would expect a certain level of I scratched, I bumped myself, I got a bruise, from normal day-to-day working activities. Our next slide is the division of responsibilities between HR versus managers. And getting back to the points we were making earlier about there's a balance between the things that HR does versus the things that management does. HR is responsible for coordinating health and safety programs and making sure that they're available for people, that they're advertised, and that they're staffed appropriately so people can learn how to be safe. They develop the reporting system so that people can find a way to report their illnesses or injuries and get that back to the company. Provide accident investigation expertise so that when an accident occurs, they're involved in investigating what happened and why things occurred, and there's a whole protocol for how we investigate accidents that OSHA can help you with. Provide technical expertise on accident prevention, and so you may have experts in your HR department that are very clear about this is how we can avoid this accident or avoid this hazard, and they help people to train people to make sure accidents don't occur. You want to make sure that there are identification systems and procedures involved to restrict people from doing things that can create an illness or an accident or some sort of injury on the job. And then when there's disaster planning or recovery planning efforts, for example, if there's a flood or a fire or a terrorist attack or something along that line, HR is responsible for helping with manage those disaster and recovery efforts. Managers, on the other hand, have to monitor the health and safety of their employees. You're responsible because you're close to them every day to keep an eye on them. So if they look like they're rubbing their eyes too much, or if they look like their wrists are bothering them or their back is bothering them, you need to investigate to make sure what they're doing is not injuring them in any particular way. You also want to coach your employees to be more safety conscious. You cannot tell your employees to work in an unsafe manner. You are obligated to tell them to be as safe as possible. If you tell them to work in an unsafe manner, and that's well documented, then you would be legally liable for any accidents and or deaths that may occur in the workplace. Managers are also involved in investigating accidents, and they work with HR to do that. They are responsible for identifying areas where there may be security problems so that we can close the loops and make sure that those security issues are addressed. And they want to make sure that they're regularly identifying where there may be some problem employees, those who are overly stressed, or they may be a risk factor to the company in terms of violence and things like that, and to let HR know about those things. Our next slide talks about safety management overall and the 4 aspects of safety management. What do we need to do in terms of making sure our culture is safe? Well, first of all, we have to have a commitment to a safe culture. So the word should always be out that safety comes first. Safety comes first. We need to have safety policies and ways to keep records, and as well as, this stuff has to go to OSHA, but we need to keep records of where there were accidents, where there were near misses, how can we fix these problems, and discipline people who are behaving unsafely so that they can, avoid accidents and liability issues. We want to make sure that we're doing safety training and communication to our employees on a regular basis. And then we want to make sure we're using safety committees, which is employees who have input into how we can be as safe as possible in the workplace. Other health concerns besides an accident or a trip and fall or some sort of industrial accident where you get electrocuted or your arm gets caught in a machine, there are other issues that we need to be aware of. Smoking in the workplace, and we've already had a couple of discussions about how companies are restricting not only your smoking in the workplace but smoking outside of the workplace. Air quality in the workplace, making sure that, if you're working with caustic chemicals or other problems, that you are making sure that there's a high quality air in the workplace so that people don't get sick from it. And also, if people are having emotional problems or mental health problems, we should be aware of these so that we can help them cope so that it doesn't escalate to a problem that becomes unmanageable. In terms of health promotion, the different kinds of things we can do to, and HR is involved in making sure that people stay safe, is thinking about how we can have an active lifestyle and to create opportunities for people to go out to exercise, to work, to have access to in-house yoga or a gym in the workplace. So everybody has an opportunity to work out and to keep their stress levels down. You can also have wellness programs, which is a way to keep people healthy. So what can we do to make sure that you don't gain weight? So we'll talk about healthy eating options, or we'll have a brown bag luncheon that addresses, how to eat well, how to not gain weight, how to, exercise in a way that's good for you. And then employee assistance programs are things that will help people with more of the psychological problems where they're addicted to drugs or they are stressed out because of some depression or other issues that are creating mental health problems. And these programs all combined will help people to stay healthy, and not only physically but emotionally and mentally. Security concerns are also a big issue. Issues of workplace violence, and you recall, perhaps you don't remember, but a number of years ago there was a thing called going postal. And going postal was related to a number of incidents where aggrieved postal workers were going back and shooting up their coworkers and their supervisors. So when someone goes postal, quote unquote, it's because they're coming back to their workplace and they're shooting up people or coming back and creating violence in the workplace because of stressors from their job. Other things that go along with workplace violence are things to recognize that a lot of the violence is not from existing employees. It may be a third party that comes in, or it may be a spouse or a boyfriend or girlfriend of a current employee who comes into the workplace because of relationship issues, and they'll come in and they'll be stalkers and they'll try to injure the person or to try to attack them or along that line. And this has happened a number of times with some workplace murders that occurred because of relationship problems, and someone becomes so obsessed that they come into the workplace and they will injure or kill someone in order to be able to manage and control them. It's a form of abuse, obviously. We want to make sure when we're selecting people and pre-screening them with background checks that we're looking for any potential security concerns, whether it's violence in the workplace or things along that nature. And then security personnel, where we want to make sure we have a guard if we need to. For our workplace, we have to decide whether they need to be armed or unarmed. Sometimes armed guards are good. Sometimes the guards are not necessary. But having the appropriate security personnel is important, particularly if you have a high security kind of job. You're working in, maybe government work or high technology that could be easily stolen. Having security personnel in place is important. Lastly, how do we look for potentially violent employees? Because we tell managers, well, you should be aware of this, but how do we then decide who is potentially violent and who is not? Typically what you see in a potentially violent person, any one of these things is not a problem. It's the combination of all of them that becomes a bigger issue. Where they exhibit an enormous amount of frustration, that there's a history of aggression, that they have obsessions or grudges against people or things, that they're loners, that they stay by themselves, they don't do a lot of work with others, they don't interact or play with others well, they have an enormous amount of stress on them, that They don't seem to have any outside activities other than work. They're quick to temper. They have not only a history of aggression, but also past violent behaviors. How does this manifest itself in the workplace? What you're going to see are verbal threats, or physical threats, or intimidation. They're going to blame everybody for their problems, but not take responsibility for their own flaws. They're always in conflict with other people. There's always a fight, or a disagreement, or some other thing. You may see a really clear behavioral change for someone who is very easygoing. Suddenly they're now off the wall, and they're aggressive, and they're nasty to people. Or there's a minor injustice and they blow it up out of proportion. And all of these things, they're not necessarily going to result in a violent employee, but it increases the likelihood that they will be violent in the workplace. So as managers, if you start to see these sorts of problems, your job is to go back to HR, to talk about it, to identify it, and to see what you can do to help get that person some help before it goes crazy. So that's the material on this lecture, and thank you.